Hello, good afternoon. My name is Adil Raz, and I am the director of the Afghanistan Policy Lab at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs. It's my great honor and pleasure to welcome you all to SPIA's new office in Washington, D.C. And it's also with a lot of pain in my heart that we're here today on August 15, 2 years after Taliban's takeover of Afghanistan. It is one of the darkest days in our life, and I'm sure it will continue for quite some time until we see the brightness. We have an amazing and a wonderful day today. Despite the pain, it was wonderful to see all of you. The solidarity we have seen and we have felt, and the collectiveness and the togetherness among women of Afghanistan. As I said, despite our hearts being broken, despite our souls being lost, but we try to come together. We try to think constructively. We try to think forward on how to use and utilize the international law and mechanisms out there to protect our rights, the rights of Afghan women, especially those who live in Afghanistan. Whatever we do, it is impossible without the support and without the voices of women of Afghanistan right now who live in Afghanistan. They're losing on a daily basis their hopes, their aspirations, and their dreams. And we must, together, all of us, cannot let this continue to move forward. I'm very honored that today was a constructive day and we had a wonderful conversation and discussion. But following that, we are able to come together and share some of what was our achievement and outcome from the discussion. We have wonderful panelists. I personally very much look forward to the discussion through this panel. But before going forward, I would like to call upon Lida Jan, who is my co-host in this great event today. Lida Jan.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Ambassador Adela. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, our esteemed guests and honorable panelists. It's my immense pleasure to welcome you all to today's event on behalf of Counterpart International. Today's gathering marks a remarkable occasion where the experts, visionary like yourself, and thoughtful leaders are here together to provide insightful discussion and take us to the new chapter. We are gathered here to delve into very important discussion topics and create a new era and also come with a solution for the problems that Afghan women are facing. We are delighted to convene today's discussion under the banner of Princeton University of International Schools and Afghanistan Lab and Counterpart International. Counterpart International is an international organization. We work around the world and we work with our local partners and partners around the world to make a sustainable change through the world, especially on women's rights and gender equality. We are very happy and delighted that today is it's such a day that while everybody is wearing black in Afghanistan, women, I'm wearing pink because I wanted to symbolize that women should not be confined with the black and should not be confined in a white dresses. They should have the right to choose and select. We want to make sure that today when we come together, we make a positive change, and we also, moving forward, we create a recommendation and a documents that we could share with the wider groups with the solution and recommendation which we have gathered from today's event. After a full day of discussion, as Ambassador Raz mentioned, we create a platform. We create a dialogue together here in this room under this roof to provide an exchange and also make sure that we move forward with a recommendations that will help Afghan women on the ground. These recommendations will not only help the Afghan women on the ground, but it will also help women us as a diaspora in our advocacy efforts around the world. I would like to again extend my sincere thanks and gratitude to our great panelists here today and to our all esteemed guests who have been here throughout the day with us. Together, we embark a journey where we create development and a sustainable change around the world. Now, I would like to give the floor to our wonderful moderator, Halvasha Kakar, who is the acting interim director at USAIP. Halvasha, the floor is yours, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And my apologies for the logistics, but we will all be getting up instead of being able to sit here and have a conversation so that everybody online can hear, as well as in the room. But welcome to today's discussion on the gender apartheid that has been unfolding in Afghanistan for the past 2 years since the Taliban have taken over Afghanistan in 2021. The context of gender apartheid has been developed based on the parallels found in gender discrimination to racial discrimination that was observed in South Africa, where apartheid policies were criminalized by the UN in 1962, and that eventually led to the collapse of the apartheid regime in 1990. Afghanistan is now being called a gender apartheid state. We've seen this and heard this in the US Congress, in UN briefings, and here at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs. We have heard from Muslim countries such as Qatar and Indonesia, and from religious leaders like the OIC and those inside and outside of Afghanistan that condemn the limitations put on women's education, employment, and fundamental rights as well. We are privileged to have now with us experts who have been part of these panels that have defined gender apartheid and its application in the international context and in the Afghan context. So let me give a brief introduction of those of our panelists here, and then I will start with questions. We have first, I'll give it in the order of who will speak, Dr. Karima Benoon. She is the Lewis M. Sims Professor of Law at the University of Michigan Law School, and she served as a UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights from 2015 to 2021. I think what's important to note is that not only has she worked for Amnesty International and worked on Afghanistan, she's also worked very closely with human rights defenders in Afghanistan for many years, including in the evacuations. And she is the author of the International Obligation to Counter Gender Apartheid in Afghanistan, which appeared in the Columbia Human Rights Law Review in December 2022, which will inform her talk today, and we're looking forward to hearing from her. Next, we'll have the Honorable Nahid Farid. She is an Afghan parliamentarian in exile, where she was the chairperson of the House's Standing Committee on Women's Affairs. She's also at Princeton University School of Public and International Affairs as an advisory board member of the U.S.-Afghanistan Democratic Peace and Prosperity Council. She's won many awards, and she is a George Washington University alumni. We look forward to hearing her contextualization of gender apartheid inside of Afghanistan. And then we'll hear from Dr. Rangita de Silva de Elwes, who is an expert on the UN Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, CEDAW, and she is a faculty at the University of Pennsylvania Law School and Wharton School of Business. She's also a fellow at Georgetown Institute for Peace and Security and a fellow at Harvard Law School on the Center for Legal Professionalism, and a researcher at on the Institute of Human Rights at Oxford. So she's got both sides covered, both Oxford and the Ivy Leagues here. But she will also draw upon her experience in shaping the whole concept of gender apartheid and how it applies to Afghanistan. Then we will hear from Uche Ezigbo, who is our sister from Nigeria, who brings experience from engaging in a similar context with the Boko Haram, but looks at it from a business angle. She's a chief distribution and stakeholder engagement officer at the Shared Agent Network facilities. She has lots of experience working in the economy. She advocates actively for gender equality and supports women entrepreneurs. And she's an advocate for how financial inclusion affects gender dynamics. And we look forward to hearing from her about the context in Nigeria and how it affects gender apartheid. So with that, let me turn it over to our panelists. First, I would like to welcome Dr. Karima Benoon to the podium to tell us more about gender apartheid. If she could help us define it, how can it be used legally, and what are some examples of how this term has been used? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. And I have been honored to visit Afghanistan 3 times, going all the way back to Mujahideen times, the end of Mujahideen times in 1996. And one constant in my 3 human rights missions was, of course, the suffering of the Afghan people. But another constant was the resistance and determination of Afghan women. And it is so inspiring to me today, 2 years after the fall of Kabul, to see that determination, despite everything that you have lost, continue. And so really, I salute your victory in this event and your victory in refusing to give up your fight for human rights. And it's truly an honor to be with you today. So I want to talk a little bit about why I started working on gender apartheid, what this concept means, and what the added value is. Back in December of 2022, I published an academic paper entitled The International Obligation to Counter Gender Apartheid in Afghanistan. And what I was trying to do was to come up with some enhanced strategies for tackling the nature of Taliban rule. And I looked at the documents and the jurisprudence in international law, but I also carried out a set of 17 interviews with Afghan women human rights defenders from different ethnic backgrounds and from different regions. And they overwhelmingly agreed with characterizing the situation in their country, even back then when I was doing the interviews at the end of 2021, as gender apartheid. And as I say, this doesn't make the international law case by itself, but it was very important in convincing me which international law case to try to make. I was also, in doing this work, trying to build on advocacy by women human rights defenders, both from Afghanistan and other Muslim majority countries, going back to the 1990s when they used the concept of gender apartheid. So there's a long history to this concept, and to learn from and really pay tribute to the Global South-led movement that helped end racial apartheid in Southern Africa in the 20th century. And indeed, Southern African voices have played a key leadership role here. Most recently, Graça Machel, the widow of Nelson Mandela, endorsing the idea of Taliban rule constituting something called gender apartheid and calling for a similar response to it as the international response, which ended racial apartheid in South Africa. She said it is a kind of apartheid, which is gender apartheid. I agree with that definition. And then she said the same vigor applied to fight apartheid should be applied to the case of Afghanistan. And what's very heartening is that when the UN Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan and the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women presented their report to the Human Rights Council in June, the government of South Africa took a similar position. So we have an official pronouncement from the government of South Africa that the situation in Taliban Afghanistan constitutes gender apartheid and that there should be an equally effective international response to ending it as there was to racial apartheid in Southern Africa. I think we should pick that up and work with that and call on the international community to live up to its obligations. And we're seeing that this term is being used even by the UN Secretary General himself, who said in January that in Afghanistan, unprecedented systemic attacks on women's rights and the flouting of international obligations are creating gender-based apartheid. And it's very heartening to know that not a single state disagreed with calling the situation in Afghanistan gender apartheid when the Special Rapporteur and the Working Group presented their report back in June. So we are seeing tremendous political progress moving in this direction. So what is gender apartheid? It has legal, political, popular, campaigning, and rhetorical significance. And unfortunately, I don't have time to explain all of those. But for me, in my own academic work, I describe gender apartheid as a system of governance based on laws and or policies, which imposes systematic segregation of women and men and may also exclude women from public spaces and spheres. So what we're talking about here is the institutionalization of the systemic oppression of women. Discrimination against women is the form of government. There is discrimination against women all around the world, but this is a very particular kind of violation. And I think the Special Rapporteur and the working group were absolutely right to suggest that the Rome Statute definition of apartheid could be applied to gender apartheid, simply substituting the term gender for the term racial in that definition. And I think that is one possible way of moving forward toward a legal definition. Let me talk about something we haven't had as much opportunity to speak about today, and that is why use gender apartheid. This framework is only important if it can actually help you and the women of Afghanistan in general in achieving your goals, in succeeding in your fight for rights. So gender apartheid and the apartheid framework generally implies international obligations. The apartheid legal framework targets not only the apartheid actor, the apartheid state, but it forces the entire international community to take concerted, principled, international law respecting action to end apartheid, which is understood as an illegal situation. So other actors, transnational corporations, governments, even international organizations like the UN cannot be complicit in apartheid, and they cannot participate in apartheid, for example, by working with all female staffs. So I think, to me, this is a critical part of the framework. As the Special Rapporteur and the working group said in their report, the apartheid framing highlights that other states and the international community at large have a duty to take effective action to end the practice, as was done to end racial apartheid in Southern Africa. So it can create the basis for a dynamic framework that not only targets the Taliban, but targets complicity with the Taliban. It is one of, I believe, the strongest tools that you have, that we all have, to use against the normalization of the Taliban and their rule through systematic discrimination. So I think my time is pretty much up. Let me say there are a number of strategies for moving in this direction. One is to use existing apartheid law, which focuses on racial apartheid, but to apply it through sort of an innovative and gender inclusive interpretation. I can give some examples of how to do that. Another is to push for explicit codification, recognition of gender apartheid in international law. Another is to do both of those things at the same time, with a sort of division of labor amongst us in doing so. And I will end by saying this. Gender apartheid is not a magic bullet. It's not a solution by itself, but it is part of the toolkit I think that we need. Engagement with the Taliban has produced no results whatsoever, and I don't believe that it will in terms of guaranteeing and protecting women's human rights. We need a galvanizing new framework, and one of the best possibilities for that is the gender apartheid framework. And I think our work today is a great way of marking this second anniversary. Thank you so much for listening.
So my second question is for the Honorable Nahid Farid, and it's really about how does this gender apartheid concept apply to Afghanistan? And really, if you could describe in broad strokes in light of the Taliban decrees and actions, how gender apartheid, this concept, applies to the Afghan context. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for wonderful opening and introduction. Talbasha John, it's my absolute honor to find myself at the same room with so many wonderful individuals that I have to raise my voice as well, with wonderful individuals who have such a determination to move forward, to make sure that this fight against the gender apartheid in Afghanistan gets the momentum and move forward to have a better situation back in Afghanistan. Back to your question, I think it's important to start with some background. We all know 2 years ago,
at the same day, unfortunately, Taliban took over in Afghanistan. Women of Afghanistan went centuries back due to the Taliban takeover. We also saw how Afghanistan women enduring a regime of gender apartheid in the last 2 years, how women of Afghanistan went centuries back due to the Taliban takeover, how the situation on the ground and the Taliban's rules and decrees and legislations unfortunately erase women from the face of the world, how they're forming the lost generation of girls by banning them from education. And all of this happening, unfortunately, in a way that after 2 years, we have to acknowledge a few points. The first point is that Taliban see their future in a radicalized Afghanistan. That's why they continue to do the same thing and they continue to do the same activity. And they have no agenda. They have no program to tackle the most important crisis, the real crisis that people of Afghanistan are facing. They are using them as bargaining chip. They are in collaboration with all authoritarian regimes that are all doing the same thing, that are all built in patriarchy, that are built in misogyny, that are supporting the same agenda that Taliban has. They're all in collaboration with most dangerous terrorist people that all also based in patriarchy and having this agenda of moving women back. And unfortunately, there is no tool. We have to acknowledge this, that there is no tool, no measure, and no system to hold the Taliban accountable at this time. We have to acknowledge after 2 years that unfortunately appeasement was not the viable strategy towards the Taliban. And time and resources gave Taliban more power to build their system of suppression against people of Afghanistan, against women of Afghanistan, against minorities, and against any developmental process that is taking place. And I think back to question, Palwasha John, women of Afghanistan are in a literal fight for their lives, not just for their rights. And the resilience and the resistance of Afghan women is exemplary, inspiring. They fight back domestically with the violence against women at home. They fight back publicly in the street. Even today, they continue this fight. They fight back economically, in some cases, by selling their kidneys, so they save their children. And this is a stark reminder of the harsh reality we face, that unfortunately, while these women are forced to make these unimaginable sacrifices, the authoritarian regime, the apartheid regime like the Taliban, turn a blind eye. They don't care that these women are selling their kidneys to save their children, because they have their agenda to move the nation toward a radicalized nation, to use this as a tool for their own agenda. So this is something that we have to acknowledge. And why it is important for international community to look to the issue of Afghan women and Afghan people and gender apartheid from a very serious and careful scope and dimension. I think there are 6 reasons that I will briefly talk about them and will humbly stop there. The first reason is that we all acknowledge that the fall of Afghanistan under the Taliban was a result of the flawed and wrong policies of international community. We have interlocutors, we have arguments, very credible ones, that actually confirm that yes, we had internal elements, but international measures could have been in a better situation. Listening to women of Afghanistan, listening to the people of Afghanistan, do not engage with the Taliban, writing down MOUs with them, don't sign Doha agreement with them, don't sideline the people of Afghanistan, the elected government of Afghanistan. So we could have a better situation. And unfortunately, that didn't happen. And whenever, if you go to the history, if apartheid system emerged, it's a flawed and wrong, and it's a result of flawed and wrong policies of international community. It was in the case of South Africa. It was in the case of Namibia. Now it is the case in Afghanistan. And therefore, the current apartheid regime we have in Afghanistan should serve as a compelling call for effective and very directive, collective action towards Taliban gender apartheid. The second reason, recognizing Taliban gender apartheid is not only crucial for Afghanistan, it's equally crucial and critical for the credibility of entire UN system. If the United Nations fails to defend the right of Afghan women at this time, if the international community and all those mechanisms that have been built to protect women cannot help the people of Afghanistan and women of Afghanistan at this time, this institution, especially United Nations, the institution of United Nations, has no credibility to do this anywhere else in the world in the future. And this is the second reason that they have to look to the issue of Afghanistan very carefully. The third reason is that the Taliban brutal 2-year in power in Afghanistan have taught us that ordinary mechanisms, like human rights mechanism, the ordinary procedures that we have, while are important, are insufficient to address the gender apartheid situation in Afghanistan. And that's why we have to have a resolute, we have to have a collective, we have to have a activity that result into something that address the human rights situation in Afghanistan and also highlight the apartheid regime. The fourth issue is that the inclusion of gender apartheid concept as a crime against humanity by United Nations is significantly important to effectively combat gender apartheid in Afghanistan. And if the UN does not take this as a stand at this time, I talked about credibility. It raises doubt about ability of this organization as well to counter gender apartheid anywhere in the world. We have episodes of apartheid all over the world. We have this episode in Afghanistan. We will have episodes in other parts of the world. That there has to be a vaccine to stop this from spreading, and this has to come from credible organizations and institutions like United Nations. The fifth reason, in a world witnessing backsliding of democracies from Afghanistan to Burma to across Central America, it's imperative for all stakeholders of democracy, for all of those who believe that democracy is the solution, to get united in defending their values. And I think that's also my point is we have to strongly believe in our shared mission towards making a more equitable, more democratic world. So those countless women who had to leave their country to seek freedom can find freedom in their own homeland. And the sixth reason is that today's Afghanistan indicates as a reality that what happened in Afghanistan can occur anywhere in the world. A group of terrorists can overthrow a democratically elected government by force, can erase the hard-won gains and achievements of the whole society or half of the society in matter of hours, in one day. And this happened in Afghanistan. This can't happen anywhere else in the world. And therefore, it is important to find out ways to basically combat this gender apartheid and eradicate it in Afghanistan. I want to wrap up because my time is up, but by calling upon all international organizations, individuals, human rights defenders who believe they are part of the human rights movement all over the world to join hands and form a global alliance against gender apartheid in Afghanistan. And I think that's how we can start strategizing, how we can start putting diplomatic pressure, starting campaigning about it, using advocacy measures around this issue. The first step is we have to have collective alliance against gender apartheid in Afghanistan. And this is how we can reclaim the freedom that is ours, that have been taken away from us by the Taliban. And we own it and we fight until we get it back. We need the solidarity of international community, not the statements of solidarity, the actions, the practical steps towards retaking our freedom from the Taliban. Thank you.
Thank you, Honorable Nahi Kareem, for that call to action for a global alliance, for talking about how Afghan women have been resilient in their work and the fact that we need some sort of a way to stop this from getting to other countries. And so if you do permit me, I will think it's right for us now to hear from other countries before we sum up with some of the international legal frameworks. So let's go to oh, okay. So should we?
Is that okay?
Sure. Okay. Well, then we'll go to Dr. De Silva. Okay. So, yeah. No. Yes. Okay. So
I'll be brief.
from the perspective from Nigeria, we wanted to hear from in terms of what are the economic impacts of gender apartheid on a country. So if you could sort of talk about the Nigerian experience and what happened, how it was before, and some, if you can share with us how some of that has been overcome and how you understand gender apartheid's effects on the economy.
Thank you very much, and it's an honor to be here all the way from Nigeria, and I'm very happy to be in your midst, and very well done in the job you're doing, and I'm also here to add my own voice. So let me start by saying that gender apartheid is not a commonly used term in the context of gender inequality and discrimination, but I understand that you're referring to systematic barriers and discrimination practices that limits women economic empowerment. So in Nigeria, as many other countries, gender inequality can indeed hinder women's financial sustainability and economic empowerment. In 2018, Nigeria, like many other countries, faced various challenges related to gender inequality. And I'm going to give some few points, how that also affected economic, impacted on economic empowerment. One of those is education. Of course, despite improvements, there were disparities in educational attainment between the genders. The girls' enrollment rate in primary and secondary education were lower compared to that of the boys. Labor force participation is also another point. Women's participation in formal labor force was generally lower than that of men. Women often faced limited access to decent jobs, wage gaps, and occupational segregation. Political representation. Women's representation in Nigeria politics was still relatively low. Women were were underrepresented in both national and local government positions, and as well as even federal positions. Healthcare, maternal mortality rates remain high due to inadequate access to quality healthcare and reproductive services, especially in the rural areas. This was linked to broader challenges in the health system, of the economy. Violence against women, gender-based violence, including domestic violence, sexual harassment, and child marriage, continue to be a significant concern. Many incidents of violence were unreportedly and lacked proper legal consequences. One of the major issues, again, is the child marriage. Nigeria had one of the highest rates of child marriage globally, and that's of very serious concern, and this is majorly in the northern part of Nigeria. Also, access to financial services. Women often face barriers to accessing financial services and credit, hindering their ability to start businesses or invest in their own future. I'm going to talk about one pathetic point, referring it to, of course, is relatively to the to the Taliban. The Boko Haram has had a significant impact in females in Nigeria. The group's activities have led to abduction, forced marriages, and sexual exploitation of women and girls. In 2014, we had the issue of the Chibok girls in the northern part of Nigeria, where over 276 girls were abducted from school, of course, depriving them from having the formal education. Some of them have also been turned to suicide bombers, and many have been subjected to physical and psychological abuse, and of course, being brainwashed to become suicide bombers. The attack and violence have also disrupted education for girls, leading to a decline in school attendance. And of course, when there's a decline in school attendance, it affects even the girls' ability to have any form of skill development and also growing in future in terms of entrepreneurship. Efforts have been made to address these issues, but impact on women and girls remain a serious concern. I'll leave this note by letting you know that this, you're not in it alone. It's also happening globally, it's also happening back home, but we're joining forces and joining the voices with you to also tackle these issues and to reduce the economic impact to have on us. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard, for giving those parallels and how you have been working on these issues from an economic perspective in Nigeria. I'd like to now ask Dr. De Silva Alves to bring us home and tell us what are some international legal mechanisms that exist for protecting women's rights in Afghanistan, how they link them to apartheid. I know you have some wonderful stories to tell, so I'm really looking forward to that.
Thank you. Even in the darkest of days, there's always light. And to me, you here in this room. Oh, I'm so sorry.
You're okay. That's fine.
Oh,
No, you're okay.
okay. So,
We'll just make sure the Zoom is still going.
did I knock it off?
No, you're perfectly fine.
Okay,
You're all
thank
good.
you.
No problem. I'll just.
Okay.
Like that.
Okay, I apologize for that interruption. As I said, even in the darkest of days, there is light. And to me, you are the beacon of hope, not just the Afghan women, but for the women of the world. I want to start by very quickly addressing the role that Princeton has played in advancing the evolution of public international law. And I hope that this moment too is a Princeton moment that we will look back in 2 to 3 years and say everything started today. So as I mentioned earlier, in 2011, Princeton convened experts, just like you have done today. And out of that expert group meeting was developed the Princeton Principles on Universal Jurisdiction. Now, we have discussed universal jurisdiction, so I'm not going to belabor the point, except share with you the summary of that report that was shared with us by Mary Robinson, then the High Commissioner for Human Rights, who said, the principle of universal jurisdiction is based on the notion that certain crimes are so harmful to international interests that states are entitled, no, even obliged, to bring proceedings against the perpetrators regardless of the location of the crime or the nationality or the perpetrator or victim. So this provides us with the fighting words to urge countries such as Germany, countries such as Spain, Norway, Finland, UK, and the United States to use universal jurisdiction that is part of their national legal system to hold the Taliban accountable for crimes against humanity. I want to then look at the ways in which Hilary Charlesworth, one of the greatest gender specialists, gender experts on international law, has bemoaned the absence of women, the invisibility of women in the public international law canon. And today what you're doing is rewriting women in the public international law canon. So thank you for giving us this opportunity to do that. I want to very quickly look at the ways in which the new gender policy of the Office of the Prosecutor in the ICC establishes a new paradigm for accountability on gender persecution and hopefully for gender apartheid. And I've distilled 6 overarching themes that will be very useful as an analytic tool for us to frame the crimes against humanity by the Taliban. So the first is intersectionality. As I've discussed before, gender is not a monolithic, and especially in Afghanistan, which hosts over 30 ethnic groups, it is important for us to use intersectionality as an analytical tool. Secondly, the ways in which international human rights law must be read along with the Rome Statute. So what that allows us is to bring the CEDAW, the Convention on the Elimination of Discrimination Against Women, as well as the other core human rights treaties, along with the interpretation of the Rome Statute. So that allows us to look at Taliban's crimes against humanity through the prism of the CEDAW. Article 10 of the CEDAW, which establishes equality in education. Article 11 of the CEDAW, which calls for equality and empowerment in terms of public life, in politics, and in employment and in labor, and Article 7, which calls for gender equality in all areas of political life. Thirdly, the gender policy of the prosecutor's office establishes and emphasizes that these crimes against humanity are socially constructed gender roles, that it establishes that the ways in which gender persecution is carried out reinforces and reveals the socially constructed gender roles. And we see that that is in reality what happens with the Taliban rule, and that it reveals a continuum of a historically structural discrimination. And we see a sickening historical continuation, a continuum of what is happening in Afghanistan. Fourthly, we are called upon to interpret gender more broadly, that is going beyond the conventional issues of crimes against humanity as sexual violence alone, to look at the ways in which gender roles are broader to include sexist grounds. And what we see in Taliban is the denial, the mass denial of education, the mass denial of women in public life, the full erasure of women in public spaces accounts for that sexist grounds. And then finally, that these crimes against targeted groups are those that not only target those targeted groups, but those who are in complete alliance, who are allies, who are in sympathy with the targeted groups. So therefore, that includes the ways in which journalists have been attacked by the Taliban. And then finally, I want to end with this case, the Al Hassan case, the Malian case, which really shows the striking similarities, sickeningly striking similarities between this Al Hassan case and the Taliban case. So in the Al Hassan case, what we saw was that Al Hassan was part of this group, which called itself a local group which called itself Helpers of Religion, and they were responsible for the fall of Timbuktu in 2012. And this local group was really marked by the ways in which they banned music. There was a mandatory burqa. The burqa was mandated, and the ways in which women were prevented from attending schools. And then there was demolition of cultural property. So you see the marked similarities between the Al Hassan case and what is happening with the Taliban. So I want to finally end with an appeal to use every strategy that is before us, including the Women, Peace and Security agenda. I've written about this and spoken about it, that we need a stand-alone Women, Peace and Security resolution that contributes to the corpus of the 1325 agenda, that looks at the ways in which denial of women and girls' education is a national security threat. It is a global security risk, and it is part of the expansion of conflict-related intellectual violence, that we have to move from this protectionist ethos of conflict-related sexual violence, which is written 140 times throughout the canon of the WPS agenda in the 10 resolutions, while education is written 9 times. So you see the hierarchy that is afforded to the protection of women's bodies rather than the empowerment of women's minds. So we would call for a special category, a special resolution that calls for conflict-related intellectual violence. And I want to end with, what is it about a girl with a book that so frightens a man with a gun? Thank you.
Thank you for ending with such a stark image of a girl with a book and a man with a gun. And what really is the threat there, and for outlining those 6 ways that we can look at gender apartheid and applying it to the Afghan context and international legal frameworks, and also for going over that concept of the protection of the intellect of women, not just the bodies of women, and the intellectual violence that happens against women in the context. So I'd like to open it up for questions at this time. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I think we can take at least 3 questions. We have some online, we have some from the audience. So if I could start from audience questions and then Peter John,
It was an online question.
would you be willing to read that? Because this is closed right now. Okay, please go ahead.
Thank you. This is amazing to hear and conceptualize, I guess, not using the word conceptualizing anymore. Talking about the women business security agenda in Afghanistan, my question to you is that I guess we do have problems. So sorry. All right. Should I stand up? Is that going to be much? Okay,
Yeah.
all right. So on the women peace and security agenda in Afghanistan, right, we did have National Action Plan on women peace and security in Afghanistan. We did practice it. We still think that the toolkit still exists. And do you think that there are issues with the resolution, there are limitations in the resolutions, right, as you explained? Do you think a non-governmental NAP would work for women in Afghanistan? I don't think we have it in the world. We don't have non-governmental national action plan on women, peace, and security. Do you think that can be a potential option? The reason I'm asking that question is that because we are having foreign policies, we're having donors trying to navigate ways to help women in Afghanistan, but I don't think they have a structured documentation while using resolution 1325.
Thank you so much. So let's take some more questions. Yalajan, please.
Thank you so much. My question is specific to my job and medical. So we have been focusing a lot on asking the United Nations to help us in recognition of gender right, while we know that UN literally is accomplice to gender apartheid and the Taliban right in Pakistan. When the Taliban banned women from working in the UN agencies abided to that decision and let the women work from home. So how do you think we should be, I mean, how much should we hope that UN will take any action on the recognition of gender apartheid or the support this?
One more, please.
Yes. One more thing is when we ask more inclusion and inclusivity in gender apartheid campaign, one of the main concerns is if it's only about women, does that so if gender apartheid only respond to the problems of women, but Taliban are bigger than that. How can gender apartheid help Afghanistan to go to regime change or a political resettlement or something that the Taliban whole regime change, and can that help with that and not remain a specific woman issue?
So we have 3 questions, one on the National Action Plan, one on whether the UN is complicit in a gender apartheid, and what does that mean when we ask the UN to work on this issue, and the third is the issue of political settlement, whether this could lead to some sort of a political settlement or regime change. So who would like to start us off? Please, go ahead.
On the National Action Plan, I think it's a very intriguing and provocative question, because by the very nature of a national action plan, it assumes that it is one that is submitted by the state party. I also happen to be the focal point on women, peace, and security for the CEDAW, so I do read very carefully the national action plans and ask state parties questions on the absence of national action plans. But in the case of Afghanistan, I think if a national action plan were to come out of an NGO coalition, it would have to be for safety's sake, NGOs that are working outside of Afghanistan. Because I cannot imagine the risks that NGOs in Afghanistan would face for writing a national action plan. So I think I hate rigidity in rules. I hate rigidity in traditional or customary international law. So I would love to see how, in the case of Afghanistan, where there is a de facto regime, could we have a coalition of NGOs writing the National Action Plan to the WPS, to the Security Council, that really looks at what is going on through the lenses of, the complete absence of education for women and girls, because that is the missing narrative. So as you know, I've read the last National Action Plan by Afghanistan, and even that report lacks the story of the ways in which women's access to education always remain very, very fragile. And so I think it is important, if we are going to push for a standalone Security Council resolution that looks at the denial of girls' and women's education as a national security and a global security threat, that also creates this new paradigm shift from looking at women's bodies to women's minds as violence against women, because it is part of the Elimination of Violence Against Women Act in Afghanistan. It is the only country in the world that has a category of violence that includes the denial of girls' education. So that is why it is so heartbreaking that it is also the only country in the world to ban education for girls in summer.
So I know we just have a few minutes left. I just want to go around to all of our speakers, and if they have answers to these questions or closing remarks. Boche?
Like was said, I think for me, it should. I think for me, let's continue to work together. You know, having to have strategic partnership in terms of bringing up ideas, to address this issue, and not just focus on only just on Afghanistan. We should pull it up internationally, because it could be happening in other countries in various ways. So that strategic partnership is very important. So that's what I will add to, and of course bringing in everyone, and also using the voice, using influencers, international figures who also believe in this to push the cause, and that will give a very positive mileage. Thank you.
Oh, you want Dr. Primo? Okay, please.
Thank you for these excellent questions. Just a few thoughts to the question of Yalda and the question of Mitra. So you're absolutely right. I think there are a lot of big questions that need to be asked right now about UN policy toward Afghanistan. We know that there's this assessment going on that the Security Council mandated. We all need to be pushing to make sure that women's human rights are at the heart of that assessment. This is critically important. I know there are many, many concerns about the UN's response to the Taliban ban on women working for the United Nations. My own view is that the UN working without women staff, so only male staff, is a violation of the UN Charter itself, given that the equality of women and men and non-discrimination, including on the basis of sex, is guaranteed in the Charter. So very problematic, and I think many, many questions that need to be asked about that, as difficult as the humanitarian situation is, and as complicated as the challenge the UN finds itself faced with. So I think it's not about asking the UN, it's about calling out the UN and all relevant international actors to do the right thing. I said a few weeks ago in a UN meeting, actually, that I believe this is going to happen. Women human rights defenders are committed to using a number of strategies, including the gender apartheid strategy. And the UN now has to decide, will it be a part of helping them to do this, or will it be one of the obstacles that they have to overcome in doing it? It's been very heartening to see many UN experts, the Working Group on Discrimination Against Women, the Special Rapporteur on Afghanistan, using the concept of gender apartheid, calling on the UN to do a comprehensive report on gender apartheid. There are other special rapporteurs I know who are considering using this framework also. And one of the things I think we have to demand is that the UN listens to its own human rights system. That's been a huge disconnect, the failure to mainstream the recommendations of and condemnations from the human rights part of the UN system based in Geneva in the rest of what the UN is doing, including on the ground. So that's something that we need to push for. But we also need to get other actors to support the gender apartheid campaigning, including the major international human rights groups, some of whom have, I think, been a little bit behind in catching up, and there also needs to be some campaigning push them to do it. And I think somebody made a very good suggestion earlier. We need artistic expression. We need sort of popular awareness raising about gender apartheid as well. And we need to push states, because ultimately it will be member states that we need to have acting through the UN system to move forward on this. And on Mitra's question, I think one of the things that's helpful about the apartheid framing is precisely because it constructs the current Taliban regime not as a cultural or a religious problem, but as a political problem, and indeed as an illegal situation that has to be ended, not as the subject of piecemeal so-called constructive engagement, which is something that was rejected on apartheid South Africa, even though certain states like the United States under Ronald Reagan tried to go that direction. And so I actually think the gender apartheid framework can be one tool for addressing the very problem that you're raising, but you're absolutely right. We always have to think about this in the full human rights context, which includes other human rights problems that also are gravely affecting men, including the use of cruel punishment. So again, going back to an inclusive approach, but making sure that inclusive approach has women's human rights at the heart.
And the last point that I want to highlight that Yaldo John, Mitra John, and Mr. John, you highlighted the concern of all of us as women of Afghanistan, that in 2021, October 2021, when I started talking about gender apartheid in US Congress, many were so hesitant talking about this term, and they were advising me not to talk about it because it is not part of international human rights and the international law. But after almost 2 years, we are in a stage that the Secretary General of the United Nations talks about it. This is happening in Afghanistan, and I think although UN, as Professor Renan also highlighted, UN charter have been assaulted by the Taliban inside of Afghanistan, not just women's rights. UN charter have been assaulted, but still UN position is not what really expected from this entity to act against gender apartheid in Afghanistan. That doesn't mean we stop or we feel pessimist. We think we have to move forward. We have to move this narrative. And create this narrative and have interlocutors like you around us to confirm that gender apartheid is happening in Afghanistan, and we have to find ways, as Professor Renita highlighted, as Mr. Akhwan highlighted today, as Ms. Banal highlighted, and Uchi highlighted, that we have to have these ways to eradicate gender apartheid in Afghanistan. This is our goal because we have to reinstate the rights and dignity of the men of Afghanistan. That's why we are here. And I have here the convention, International Convention of Suppression of and Punishment of the Crime of Apartheid that came to signature in 1973. In 1973, it came to signature. In 1979, all governments that had sympathy with the apartheid regime in South Africa lost their reasons and any means to continue supporting apartheid regime in South Africa politically, militarily, and economically. So this happened like 7 years after such resolution came into signature. We think maybe something like that can happen to eradicate Taliban from this gender apartheid regime that they are practicing in Afghanistan. Takes time. This is our goal, and I think with the stamina and with the commitment and with the determination, with accepting each other, with uniting towards our shared goal, we can achieve that goal, and we can reclaim the freedom that we deserve to have, not just for ourselves, but for the next generation of Afghans.
Thank you so much. Thank you for that. And thank you all for really defining how this is an illegal situation in Afghanistan, how gender apartheid has really, it's not just about a concept, but it's really, as we heard earlier today, it's really a criminal act and it's an illegal act. And thank you, Honorable Nahid Farid, for that global call to action, for really being able to change the lives of Afghan women inside of Afghanistan, and for there to be a country for all of those who have been exiled from that country to go back to a place where they have their rights. Thank you so much for participating in today's discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. I mean, thank you.
Stop the Zoom. Want to ask a question or cut it?
Whose phone is there?